So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio.
Welcome to Trending. It's our weekly marriage hour here on Trending every Thursday. And my guest coming up in just a little bit is Layla Miller. She's the author of the book, Raising Chaste Catholic Men. She herself raised 6 boys. She's well known here on Trending for addressing topics of impossible marriages that have been redeemed, telling the incredible stories of the faith of so many individuals who thought their marriage was beyond saving. But there's another story we don't often hear, and that's something she often tells here on Trending. She also talks about the impact that divorce has on the children of divorce all the way into their adult lives. But this time we're talking about raising chaste Catholic men and how men have been trained out of manhood and how we can change that. Lean in, parents. We need moms and dads involved here. If you didn't catch yesterday's episode, one of the greatest takeaways from Joseph Chayambra here on the show, as he shared the path of sinfulness and brokenness that he himself went through, really touched on the necessity of parents, especially fathers, and the affirmation that you men can give in a special way to your children. And so we'll be joined in just a little bit with Layla Miller here on Trending. During our marriage hour, though, I was thinking about a topic that was trending in the top couple of trends on social media yesterday. And just a slight warning for little ears. We'll be careful with kind of the conversation here, but this is what was trending. It's National Sexual Health Month, if you didn't know that. And trending on Twitter yesterday was hashtag #SextShanAnything. Now, Shan Boudram is the host of Sexology, and she answers any questions you want to ask. Now, if you don't know what sexting is, that's where you're texting messages that have to do with fill in the blank. So this was a really interesting hashtag. I briefly peeked at it, not encouraging others to do so, but I wanted to see what was the takeaway that we can have as people of faith on this topic, because I think there's a legitimate issue happening right now. People are going to the wrong places for legitimate questions. Even children. They're Googling or asking the wrong friends who will have the wrong answers because they're the only people willing to have those conversations without any qualms. It points yet again to that need for mentorship, and it also points to the need for deeper friendships with people of the same sex. I think this is something that we've lost and that has changed in the culture. We no longer emphasize as much as we used to those male-only relationships and those female-only relationships. Those relationships that really do have a great impact in forming our character and helping us to discuss and address rather difficult issues and topics, maybe that even occur within marriage. And so I think that this is what I really took away from this trending hashtag on Twitter yesterday. In the top 3 was that hashtag #SextShanAnything. It's because people really do have questions. And I have to tell you, it reminds me of the work I've done working with women in crisis pregnancy, sidewalk counseling in front of the abortion clinic, and working with the droves of young people, male and female, who find themselves having very serious questions with regard to the topic of chastity when I've had the opportunity to travel and speak to them in person. At times after an event, I'll stand there for hours with one question after another. And I have to tell you, one thing that stands out so often is that not only are the young people, but even adults there and ready and waiting in line to ask complicated questions about intimacy that they're not really sure how to navigate. They maybe feel uncomfortable asking a priest due to modesty, but they also feel uncomfortable asking many friends or family members. They also are concerned about what the answer will be from certain individuals, and so they're silent and they shut in on themselves. But here's a real topic that I think I want to address here in the coming weeks on Trending, especially during our marriage hours. What burning questions do you have that we can help answer here on Trending? Because sexuality is a great gift. What happened when we used to talk about making love, not just having sex? Let's elevate the beauty of human sexuality yet again. But that means we also have to go deep in answering some of those difficult and tricky questions and sometimes messy situations. So I encourage you to reach out and send in your questions on social media to me that I'll be taking over the next couple weeks, especially during our marriage hour next week. Here are just a few that I'd like to mention, which we won't dive into today, but they're legitimate questions that people have, married and not. Why do so many men send unwanted images of themselves to women? What if you're being pressured to do something within marriage you don't feel comfortable doing, or outside of marriage? But this also happens quite often in marriage as well. What if you find yourself feeling extremely self-conscious with regard to the marital embrace before you get married or even once you've been married? And also another tricky one is, how do you bring your wife up to speed within the context of intimacy? How do we find that complementarity that is so important even in those most intimate moments? Those are questions that we're happy to take here on Trending. Feel free to reach out. You can head over to relevantradio.com/trending to get connected on social media and send in your questions, especially on Instagram. Here's the reality. The culture will lie to you about your body. The culture will tell you that what you do with your body doesn't matter. So have at it. Enjoy it. Whether you're married or you're not married, whatever way you swing, that's what the culture tells you. And again, people are Googling information because there just aren't resources out there, and we have to respond as a church, as mentors. I have a story for you because I want to talk about why sex belongs in marriage, and I want to talk about some of the science of that here on Trending during our marriage hour. Because there are so many people who have no idea the chemical complementarity that's taking place to bond and connect two human beings in an incredible way. But first, let me tell you a story. While I've worked with girls in crisis pregnancies situations, you wouldn't believe how many women have refused to leave abusive relationships because of the emotional and chemical bond that was created within the context of intimacy outside of marriage. You see, it's like when they begin to engage in intimacy, there's a pair of glasses, dark glasses that filter out some of the flaws of the other person. And they're no longer able to see them, or they begin to justify some of those faults. Now, within the context of marriage, this could be somewhat of a gift. But outside of marriage, before trying a friendship, before knowing if a person is safe, committed, responsible, emotionally stable, this can be quite dangerous, in fact. And so we'd often see women who wanted to leave the abusive men in their lives, but couldn't get themselves to because of the emotional and chemical bond that had developed. So here's what we need to understand within the context of this story. This is why sex belongs in marriage. And just a reminder, I said it earlier, a little warning for young ears, but we'll try to keep it light with the conversation. So here are some of the chemicals that are released within the context of intimacy. Dopamine, norepinephrine, oxytocin, vasopressin, endorphins, and serotonin. You see, these chemicals do a number of things that we'll walk through here. But some of them have to do with making you alert and having a sharp sense of focus. You see, the dopamine gives you this sense of pleasure high. And it leaks, we could say, into your brain this idea to remember something and the fix that you had when you engaged in it. Norepinephrine tells the brain, prepare. Something is about to happen. Get ready. This is important. Oxytocin and vasopressin bind memories to the person or thing you're engaging with. Serotonin gives you this sense of calm and relaxation after. You see, intimacy works the way it was created to function, with your spouse alone. A spouse who you've gotten to know and you've discerned and made a commitment to for life. You see, sexual activity outside of marriage has led to drastic levels of depression, rather than to the closeness of marriage and love and affirmation, which many are ultimately looking for. Go look at any college campus and the hookup culture that's occurring, and talk to those young women the morning after. Look into their faces, and you will see, again, that it's creating a culture of depression rather than that of closeness, which is sought out in marriage, love, and affirmation. You see, together within the context of intimacy, these chemicals that I've been talking about, you can experience a high sense of alertness or pleasure, a deep sense of calm afterward. This is the norepinephrine and the endorphins and serotonin working. With intimacy, you are emotionally bonding to this person through oxytocin and vasopressin. Over time, a craving for physical intimacy is actually transformed. It's transformed into a desire for one another. That's dopamine. You see, the human soul will only feel affirmed, safe, and excel with this incredible chemical cocktail if the relationship has the four goods of marriage that should be assented to when we marry. Because all these chemicals kicking in are great if it's within the context of marriage. It's going to help bond you to someone for life. It's going to help you stay connected to them, to let go of some of their faults, to feel affirmed, to feel peacefulness, to feel pleasure, to create a new human life. All of these are incredible things. So this is why when we make those assents to these four things, these four goods of marriage, it actually creates this affirmation and a safe place for you to excel as a human being within your marriage. Those four things that St. Augustine and the tradition of the church speaks of is that every marriage makes, even within the vows themselves that are exchanged, that you come to this marriage freely. You're not being coerced. You're freely choosing to love this person through good times and bad. That you're totally giving yourself to this person and this person alone. No extramarital affairs. No side relationships. No emotional relationships, or even, might I say, visual relationships or emotional relationships with photos, videos, or even just colleagues in the workplace. Number 3, you're called to be faithful, which also touches on that total dimension. You're totally giving yourself to one person. That faithfulness, that sense of permanence while on earth is so important. Isn't this what we long for? That affirmation that who I am not only is good, but who I am is enough. This is seen through your fidelity. And finally, that your love is fruitful. Yes, to be open to life, to have children, but also fruitfulness goes even further than that. Fruitfulness is not only this openness to life, but this growing of you together as a couple and how you engage with the world around you. You've heard it said before, we talk about marriage and we also often imagine these two people face to face and the sunset off in the distance. Well, in reality, marriage is more so side by side, taking on the challenges and joys of life. And from that, things are fruitful. Good things come. The church in the document Humana Vitae written by Pope Paul VI back in the 60s really summarized this entire idea of marriage by saying that every sexual act needs to have two components. Every sexual act must be unitive, that is for the good of the spouses, just like being free, total, faithful, and fruitful is. And 2, it needed to be procreative. If the unitive and the procreative dimension of intimacy are not present, There are damages that will be done to the soul, to the child that will be created. Because intimacy is for the good of the human persons, for the good of the marriage, for the pleasure, for the development of the relationship, but also oriented toward creating new life, because your love should go beyond just you and your other person. It's not just your Shangri-La honeymoon phase. I keep thinking of the words of St. John Paul the Great in his catechesis series, Theology of the Body. He said, man, referring to humanity, must rediscover the lost fullness of his humanity and want to regain it. We must rediscover this lost fullness of humanity, of intimacy, and seek desperately to regain it. Because this is the challenge of the culture. I mentioned at the beginning of the show, yesterday on Twitter, one of the top trending topics was #SextShanAnything, answering all of your questions about sex and so on. And it's heartbreaking to see the questions that people have and the confusion that's developed. Why? Because we've taken babies out of sex. We've taken sex outside of marriage, and so what happens? The very dimension of the maleness and femaleness and the complementarity of the two persons diminishes. The protection that a mother has to not be left alone to care for a child diminishes. The fruition and development of the male character diminishes because he no longer has a sense of responsibility. And who at times suffers the most? That child who's sacrificed on the altar of us having taken babies out of sex and sex outside of marriage, to the travesty of abortion. If we do not rediscover this lost fullness of humanity, as John Paul II talks about in his Theology of the Body, we're going to continue to flounder. This is why we have to engage those difficult and uneasy questions, such as those that are asked on the hashtag on Twitter that's been trending, #SextShanAnything. Because if we aren't answering the questions, who is? Google? This sexology show that's totally secular? Who will answer those questions? I'll never forget a couple years ago, I was speaking at a conference, and Doug Barry was one of the other speakers there with me, and we were receiving question after question from some of the young participants, and the questions were very bold. They were really difficult questions and topics that these young people were struggling with. And I remember Doug at one point feeling kind of like sitting there, like his modesty was suffering in the midst of this conversation. And I remember at one point he said, listen, some of these things I don't even talk to my wife about. These things that we would never discuss in public. Things that you might even be looking at me and you might be typing up that email right now. I can't believe that Timmery just talked about this on Trending. But you see, he said, we don't have the luxury, unfortunately, anymore to not engage in this conversation. And so when people complain, oh, you opened your mouth about something, well, there's a legitimate question and there's a legitimate answer that has to be given. And so sometimes we need to be a little more willing to have those conversations, even when it hurts, even when it's challenging. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. It's great to be with you. Here's the thing. I have a question for you. If you're single, I want you to answer this question. What is the goal of dating? We just had this whole context given of why sex belongs in marriage. So with that in mind, or even whatever philosophy you've created in your own life about dating, I'd love to hear it. What is the goal of dating? I went ahead and put a post up, one of my Instagram photos that I just posted. Go ahead and comment in the comment section on that photo, because I think that we often might say in one word marriage, but then what are the steps in the dating process that will get us there? Or maybe you think dating's to have fun, dating's to meet people. I want to hear what you have to say. Let's define this a little further. Go ahead, I'm going to leave that photo up. I've posted it as an actual photo. It's not just on my story. I want you to go ahead and leave a comment telling me what you think. I'll add it to my story as well right now so that you can see it. Because it's a legitimate question that we have to ask. Because if we don't know the answer ourselves, how are we going to date, or how are we going to help other people who are going through the process of dating? I had a couple questions came in that I want to address. Angela on Instagram asked, for those people who are over the age of 40, is there a cutoff that makes having children irresponsible? For example, you're over 40 and perhaps you have to take care of your elders. This is a great question. The first question I have back at you, Angela, is if you don't plan on having children, what do you plan on doing? How do you plan to go about that? Because contraception isn't an option. Not only because it is not open to life, as the church talks about, which we just discussed, but two, it's bad for our bodies. Our bodies shouldn't have to suffer the way they do because of hormonal contraception. Condoms also aren't an option. You see, when we close ourselves, not just physically and chemically to having children, but even with a barrier type of method, this creates problems within the relationship itself. There's this sense of not totally giving yourself to another person. So much could be discussed. That being said, there are legitimate challenges. Maybe you have quite a few children. Maybe you are dealing with the care of a child who has special needs, or elderly loved ones who you've brought into your home, and having children will become difficult. This is where reading as a couple the encyclical Humanae Vitae is so important, because Pope Paul VI emphasizes that if we're going to use, for example, natural family planning, there really needs to be a legitimate reason. And you as a couple are culpable before God for that reason, a grave reason. And so this is something you're called to discern prayerfully and before God. Hysterectomies and these other things are not options because it's permanently closing yourself off to having children. And we could go more into that question if you would like. We could take it up another day here on Trending. But again, it needs to be a legitimate reason, prayerfully considered, and I would even say having had wise counsel from a number of individuals such as priests and so forth. Not to share your public business with anyone, but it is a grave decision to choose not to have children. And it can have a grave impact if done for the wrong reasons. And again, natural family planning would be the option, just like it can help you conceive children with a fertility care practitioner. It can also help you, if necessary, abstain from having children by using those infertile periods for intimacy. Another question that came through on Instagram from Myra is, can you cover a little about long-distance relationships, and when either person visits, how you can remain pure while finding a place for the other person to stay and visit in the area? This is a great question. What happens when you're in a long-distance relationship and you want to visit each other? There are a lot of challenges that come with that. And number one, you need to know yourself and what those limits need to be, what those boundaries are, what those time curfews are. If you need to be in public places, if you can't be alone together, those are key, because sometimes the distance can really weigh on chastity. Not even just the fact that the person's staying nearby and you're trying to remain pure, just that long physical absence can make it challenging. So I encourage you to find friends to stay with, to surround yourselves with friends and family, to make sure it's not just the two of you all the time in those situations. And I challenge you that if visiting is not possible without some of these key elements, then perhaps another solution needs to be considered. We'll be right back here on Trending.
Day 10, Mother Most Chaste, pray for us. It's not that the church is hung up on sex or the church is prudish. It's simply that the church promotes and defends human dignity and recognizes that the human race is the pinnacle of God's visible creation. Human beings have been created for eternity, to give glory to God. That's why the church guards and elevates human sexuality and protects it in the sacred bond of matrimony. Children have a right to know their mother and father. Children have a right to be born and raised in a family. And the human race is a blessing to planet Earth. That's why the virtue of chastity is necessary. It safeguards sex and places it within the stability of marriage. Sex is always safe when used as God has intended it, between a man and a woman, open to life and within marriage. In that context, it is holy. Mother Most Chaste, pray for the church and our nation.
Receive these free daily messages by signing up at relevantradio.com/novena.
Catholic professionals find purpose and take your career to the next level by experiencing Tepeyac Leadership Initiative. TLI is a 5-month experience, which you can access from anywhere in the U.S. Visit tliprogram.org to learn more. Turn your Catholic faith into the driving force in your career through professional development and spiritual growth. Go to tliprogram.org now. Be part of the next generation of Tepeyac leaders. tliprogram.org.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Welcome back. My guest today is a new regular here on Trending. She's been with us to speak about the impact of divorce on adult children after they've been through the divorce of their parents at some point in their life. And she's also joined us to talk about impossible marriages that have been redeemed. But today our conversation centers around boys and the crisis of masculinity in our modern culture. Her name's Layla Miller. She's the author of the book Raising Chaste Catholic Men, among a number of others. And when I was thinking about bringing her on, it happened to be that this week I was sitting on the couch in the morning looking at Instagram. And all of a sudden, this video came up. And it was from Northcliffe, Johannesburg, and it was an attempted kidnapping. And my jaw was just dropped. You know, I'm a new mom. I'm expecting my first child, and I'm the oldest of 4 kids. And I always remember being really careful about not leaving their side when they were really little in particular, because there are a lot of risks out there in the culture. But what happened in this attempted kidnapping was a man sitting at a table nearby saw the man coming, grabbing for this kid, and he literally wrestled him to the ground. And it was a reminder that our men need to be prepared to stand up, to lean in, and do what they have to do when other people are at risk. A total stranger, in fact. I think this is the crisis of our culture. Boys don't know when to pick up a stick and charge into a house to defend someone, nor do men, because many men are, quite frankly, not trained into that masculine identity to be a provider and protector. So joining me is Layla Miller to discuss raising chaste Catholic men and the problem of how we've trained men out of manhood. Layla, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Timmery. I'm really pleased to be back here with you again.
You know, I keep thinking about your work, especially in your book, Chaste Catholic Men, and you talk about how the most important chapter in many ways is that training men out of manhood. And one of the stories you tell is about this feminist activist blogger and how she treated her 6-year-old son. Can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe how that triggered you to write this piece?
Yes. In fact, my jaw was on the ground when I saw this. There was I don't even know if she's still around, but there was a blogger called Plain Jane Activism. Yeah, that's what she went by. And she is clearly, a non-Catholic feminist activist. And on her little sidebar, she identified herself as a mother who, quote, regularly annoys her 6-year-old son by staging peace talks with his action figures and by grounding him whenever he attempts to rescue a princess. Unquote. And I almost cried because I thought of this little boy, the first woman in his life, the woman who, is just his everything, punishing him essentially for his innate, God-given instinct to be masculine, to protect a damsel in distress, to fight a battle of good and evil between his action figures. And here he is, this is, again, hardwired into a man's nature. And his mother is saying, you're bad. That's bad. Don't do that. Don't feel that. Don't be that. And my heart just breaks because I know that is how we have trained pretty much a few generations of boys. And the more that we have no fathers in the home or fathers who are just completely, emasculated, we have more and more of it. So it was heartbreaking to see that, because I have 6 boys of my own and also 2 girls, and I know how boys are and how wonderfully they're made. So that just absolutely shattered my heart into a million pieces, but also made me realize now I can see what's wrong with this culture.
This example you gave of this activist blogger setting up these peace talks between the action figures makes me think of Avengers, and how at a certain point we saw Avengers Civil War break out, and how all the Avengers are no longer getting along. And part of it has to do with the fact that there are peace talks and all these restrictions being placed on them by the United Nations and other entities that are trying to control the Avengers. And it's so funny because my feminine heart was not looking forward to the Avengers Civil War, where they were all going to be fighting against each other, and I kept complaining leading up to the movie. And I remember my brother looked at me, he was in high school at the time, and he goes, "Timmery, are you kidding me? This is great. You get to see all of your favorite action figures fighting against each other for what you believe is right." And it made me laugh so hard because it was such a stark contrast. Like, oh, I don't want them to fight. And my brother's like, are you kidding me? This is pretty epic. But at the same time, the problem within the midst of this is that the peace talks were being forced upon the Avengers in the actual story. Yet this is exactly what's happening in our modern day culture. People don't know when to step up. And then there's this extreme aggression when they finally do because they're so fed up.
Right. And so we also have that culture who hasn't taught us right from wrong. So you've got that problem is, when do we fight for good? When do we fight for evil? When we don't even know what good and evil is anymore. And then we're saying that, but violence, even channeled in the right way, we're telling our boys, don't be violent, don't be violent. If they pick up a stick, like you said, or if they do some fake sword play, or, I have the best memories of my sons when they were little, making these duel videos. They'd be dueling and they'd be laughing, but it was like, clearly the good guy and the bad guy. And that's the sort of thing that boys would need to work out. Like, okay, it's good to fight for the good. You want to fight evil. And so that's part of their formation, is they have this masculinity. They're always going to have it. The question is, are they going to channel it for good, or are they going to channel it for evil? Because they're not going to change their nature. It could be sublimated, it could be perverted and twisted, but the male nature is still there. So we need to learn how to form our boys to, first of all, tell them we love their nature as men, as masculine boys, and we want it, and God wants it, but that we can channel it for good, so that really it is always about using it to fight against evil and to protect what is precious and good.
That's Layla Miller here on Trending with Timmery. We're talking about the problem of training men out of manhood. In just a little bit, we'll be talking about how to train boys to be men. Now, as you're talking, Layla, being a mom of 6 boys, some of whom are adults, where does video games play into this? And what was your approach with video games?
Yeah, the approach with video games. So it's, it's a mixed bag. I have mixed feelings about them. I don't love the addictive nature of video games. However, I also know that I know one psychologist that has said it's not all bad if it is about giving them an outlet to do what we don't do anymore with boys, which is that they do set up a battle between good and evil. So in that sense, okay, if the video games are about having these battles between good and evil, getting that warrior spirit out there, it's okay in moderation. An interesting thing is, this is kind of almost an aside, but once when I was complaining about video games to one of my sons, and he's now married, he's a doctor and has a family of his own, but when he was still single and he was in med school and he was alone, he said, "Mom, remember, I'm on the video games, which might be keeping me in my lonely hours and in the middle of the night, from doing something else on the internet. So it's not all bad. I'm working out a lot of my energy on fighting on a video game." So I thought, well, that's a good point too. So the approach, I don't know. That's a question that stumps me to this day. Is I don't love video games, but on the other hand, they do serve some outlet for giving our boys a chance to have these battles that the culture isn't letting them have in the real world. So judiciously, moderately, I'm not 100% opposed, but if I had to do it again, I don't know. I don't know what I would do differently, but it's a rough one.
It's a hard one, and I see, the fact that so many young boys are turning to video games, and some people say, well, it's just them turning to another form of aggression, but at the same time, I wouldn't quite say that necessarily. If it's not the right video game and not in moderation, sure, but yeah, I do see that balance that with some moderation, it could be setting up that imaginary world of good versus evil. But also I think this has been lost in terms of reading as well. Young kids just don't read the same amount of literature that they used to, that set up those same battles to kind of psychologically work through.
Absolutely. I wish that reading were more prevalent these days, and it's not. The whole culture of social media has destroyed so much of the imagination and just the simplicity of things and the being kind of by yourself and being in nature. I had one, speaking of chaste men, I have a friend who is now grown, but he was a farm boy. And he said that he had actually asked me about this book. He's like, I know you wrote this book on chaste men. He said, you know what makes chaste men? Working on a farm. He said, we grew up on a farm and we were working our bodies and we were busy all the time. And they didn't have, the energy or the excess energy really to be interested in pornography and other things. They were busy doing manly things with their bodies and, for their families. So I thought that was really interesting too. And I've always thought that, every man needs to kind of be born on a farm or something.
And it's interesting right now because there's this crisis in terms of what am I going to do for college? And fewer and fewer people are going to college right now. We're seeing a little bit of a shift again, partially because of the demographic. They're less young people. But what's fascinating is when you talk to young people, those who have really worked with their hands during those developmental high school years have a better idea of what they want to do with their life, and also of a sense of responsibility that is striking in comparison to most teenagers today. You're listening to Trending with Timmery. I'll be right back here with Layla Miller. We're going to talk about how we can train boys to be men again.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmery on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Layla Miller is my guest. She's the author of the book Raising Chaste Catholic Men, and we're talking about a portion of her book where she discusses the problem of training men out of manhood. It's a cultural norm today, but how do we bring back the attitude that we're training boys to be men? We often hear this kind of comment that, well, boys will be boys, and there are two approaches. One is that, well, it's not okay to have that approach because then we're forming violent rapists. And the other approach is, even from many Christian people, is, well, boys are just going to look at porn. They're just going to do these different things. And we just kind of have to let that happen. That's not what we're saying when we're saying we need to train boys to be men. So, Layla, here's my question. You talk a lot about helping boys to be protectors, providers, and heroes. What can moms do to allow boys the space to develop the protector, provider, and hero within?
So, I want to back up and just say we have to remember the complementarity that God created between men and women. So, go back to the garden. Men and women are not the same. I've often asked a lot of Catholic women, especially younger Catholic women who kind of call themselves maybe Catholic feminists, they will say things like, well, we love that God created us complementary. And then they'll go on to say basically how everybody does the same thing and everybody acts the same way, and that's good. And I've never yet had anyone answer the question, well, when you say that you're glad that there's complementarity, what is the complementarity? What does it look like? What does that mean, and how does it play out practically in the world, in a family, in a marriage? And they never really have thought of that part. So if you love complementarity the way that God designed it, you really have to think, well, what does that look like? What does that mean? Because it has to mean something in real life. So part of it is this idea that we cannot treat our daughters the same as we treat our sons, in the sense that we do want our sons to be gentlemen. We want our sons to be protectors and providers. And we don't want them, if we do want that, we'd want them to grow up and be the men that lead their family, that are heroes. And again, protection and provision is what they're made for. Then we have to sort of let them have that adventurous spirit. We have to not hover over them, as we mothers tend to do. If they want to climb that tree or take that risk or whatever, and we can't stifle our husbands, who seem to know better than we do, that boys need to have this space to hurt themselves a little bit, maybe, or play those sword games, those fake sword games, and not be so worried that as we, by our tender, more feminine nature, we would not want anyone to ever get hurt. We don't want anyone to make hurt another person's feelings. Or there was that famous Gillette commercial where they're showing these two boys wrestling in the grass, and they have these men, these fathers, come in and say, "Oh, don't wrestle. Are you kidding me?" No actual man would say that or do that. Only another man bred out of manhood would say, "Hey, boys, stop wrestling in the grass with each other." That's what they're supposed to do. That's how they learn to become strong men and to fight and to be physical and channel that to the good. While we are watching in the background, certainly, to make sure nobody gets really, really hurt. But that's just absurd that we put everybody in a bubble, and our boys, and we tell them to be so delicate.
Layla, how can dads communicate to their wives these aspects of male development without criticizing or contradicting a mother's desire to soften the untamed dimension of the developing male character?
Right, because we know that women do civilize men, so that's a good thing. That's part of it. But the problem is, well, it's a tricky question, because now in the marriage dynamic, we do have an emasculation of our husbands as well. So it's very hard for a man to say, "Honey, let our sons wrestle.
Right.
Let them play these games with each other. Let them have sword play or dueling or cops and robbers and that has to do again with generations of men have to step up and say, in their gentle way, hopefully to the wife, men and women are not the same, honey. Men and women aren't. They could go back to the garden. They could, if this is a Catholic couple, and say what I learned, which is just so beautiful, that when God created Adam, the first thing he saw was the created world. He saw the things of the world. He saw things to subdue. He could build. He could till the soil. Create cities, create a culture. And then when Eve was created, the first thing that she saw all the created goods of the world too, but she saw a person in that view front and center. So she's very relational. She's very much about connections between people. But that's her gift. The man's gift is to work with the created world, to work with his hands, to work with the earth, to work with building and what is out there. So if maybe he could explain that to her, that her gifts are so beautiful because they're relational, they're about people to people, but his are about building and doing and going and protecting, then maybe she would have an insight into that. And it's just stuff we haven't been taught. We never think about it because we're supposed to treat men and women the same. We're supposed to treat girls and boys the same and raise them exactly the same. And that denies their inherent gifts that God gave men and God gave women. It's not supposed to be the same.
That's Layla Miller here on Trending with Timmerie. She's the author of the book Raising Chaste Catholic Men, along with others. We'll post links to those. You can also find her at laylamiller.net. Now, Layla, it's a fine line to walk because young boys are hungry for models of masculinity, and they often don't have them. And so they often ask prying questions that are basically questions that set them apart, where they're trying to see, do you see that I'm different from you as a woman? Or do you see that I'm like you, just a younger man, when talking to men? And I found myself, we were talking about this before the show, a few summers ago we were speaking at a conference at Vox Vitae, and I was doing a boys session with some young boys, and they asked the question about, what do you think about women belonging in combat? And I knew that it was this important question for them to set themselves apart from girls and how they understood their own identity. How did you feel like that went? And I would love your opinion, especially as the mom of 6. And I know that we had talked a little bit about it after as well.
Yeah, I was so worried because whenever a boy asks that question of anyone, I get worried because I think that the wrong answer is going to come back to those poor boys looking for a purpose, looking for a role in this culture. And you gave the perfect answer. Basically, you said, no, it's really not the place of women to be in combat. That's kind of the job of a man. I mean, you said it much more eloquently than I just did. But the boys almost seemed relieved because, again, they don't have a place in this world. If we as women not only take on what only we can do, which is the bearing and the nurturing and the nursing of a baby, of being near them as they're small and knowing that that's our job as a mother. We know that from our bodies, that we're born to nurture. But if we also take over the rest of things, such as the protection and the fighting and we're providing and we're out there working, we're doing everything, what is the role of a man anymore? We wonder why we have all these men just wandering, these boys just who don't know who they are, what they're supposed to do. It's been said that women know innately, they know who they are because we have breasts, we have wombs, we are relational, we get each other. A man has to be told how to be a man. He has to be taught how to be a man. And he can only be taught that by another man. And so you can see why we're so broken, because there are no fathers, there are no role models, all the men want to be like women, all the men think they are women. I mean, we have this problem. So when you said that to these boys, I felt like you were a woman handing them their affirmation, handing them their masculinity and saying, we are not the same. We want you to protect us. We want you to do what you were made to do. And you may not realize, because nobody ever told you, that it's a special role. It's different from what we do as women. So it was beautiful, but it gave them hope. Like, I just feel like we need to give these poor boys some hope.
It was a learning moment for me as well, because it was one of those where I go, okay, I know people aren't going to be happy about me saying women don't belong in combat, and I know I'm going to have to cover it soon here on the show now, but I really do think there's so many moments where boys are trying their moms. I'm sure your sons have tried you, like, how am I different? How are you going to handle my masculinity in this circumstance?
I can tell you recently, do you want an anecdote here?
We have a brief, about 30 seconds, please. 30
seconds. My son, who was trained as a Marine, was teaching my husband recently how to use a firearm, and which I'm totally for. I'm fine with that. And I remember coming in and I was like, well, wait a minute, should you be doing that in this room? And I remember I interfered with the two of them, and my son looked at me as a man, and he was like, Mom, please. And you could tell he was like, I am doing a manly thing here with my dad. You're interfering and being worried. And I remember just feeling, oh, okay, I need to get out of this scenario because these are two men talking about protecting the family. And it was like a real wake-up call. And I just thought everything I taught suddenly came true in that moment.
That's Layla Miller. So much to be said on raising chaste, good Catholic men. Stay tuned. She'll be back again soon. Learn more about her work at laylamiller.net and be sure to pick up her book.
Day 10, Mother Most Chaste, pray for us. It's not that the church is hung up on sex or the church is prudish. It's simply that the church promotes and defends human dignity and recognizes that the human race is the pinnacle of God's visible creation. Human beings have been created for eternity, to give glory to God. That's why the church guards and elevates human sexuality and protects it in the sacred bond of matrimony. Children have a right to know their mother and father. Children have a right to be born and raised in a family. And the human race is a blessing to planet Earth. That's why the virtue of chastity is necessary. It safeguards sex and places it within the stability of marriage. Sex is always safe when used as God has intended it between a man and a woman, open to life and within marriage. In that context, it is holy. Mother Most Chaste, pray for the church and our nation.
Receive these free daily messages by signing up at relevantradio.com/novena.